What's up, people? For one of our big topics about the 1980s, we got to talk about the kind of ending or fizzling out of the Cold War, and then also people like to talk about not only who started the Cold War, but then who won the Cold War, and who do we give credit to ending the Cold War, having quote unquote peace with the Soviet Union. So kind of go through this pretty quickly and just summarize a bit, because I don't want you spending a ton of time with your foreign policy in the 1980s, like strictly on the broad strokes of the Cold War ending, but more so some of the intervention that the U.S. engaged upon during that time. So actually, before we start going into what's happening in the 1980s with the end of the Cold War, we're actually going to take a step back into the 1970s and look at what was happening with U.S.-Soviet relationships during that time. So after the Vietnam War and U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War ends in the 1970s, and then eventually South Vietnam's successfully invaded by North Vietnam, kind of falls to communism in 1975. Richard Nixon begins to try to open U.S. relations with communist China, and the kind of blessing, I guess, for the U.S. within the Cold War was that the Soviet Union and China, despite the fact that both of them were very large communist countries, they never really got along as really great allies. So the U.S. starts to try to open up their relations with China through a variety of measures, one being ping pong competition. So one of my favorites is the scene in Forrest Gump, where Forrest Gump is playing ping pong against the Chinese, and that was actually obviously Forrest Gump isn't actually real, but that was a big part in opening relationships, was like friendly sport between the U.S. and China during that time. Then you had the strategic arms limitation treaties, which was just reducing nuclear weapons and ballistic weapons between the two countries. You also had a little bit of that with the Soviet Union as well during that time, and also just cordial visits. So Richard Nixon, despite the fact that not a ton of people liked him a whole lot, he did make some visits to China and got along pretty well with the Chinese government and the members of the Communist Party. So just having those cordial visits, and they generally call this period in the late 1970s détente, not détente, détente, which means a lessening of tension. So it's seen as this time period with both, especially with China, but also with the Soviet Union, of being this time where tensions were kind of fizzling out and weren't as electric, if you were, as they were during some of the earlier Cold War periods. And then you also see a transition during this time, the U.S. taking its focus away from Europe and Southeast Asia and looking more into the Middle East for its attention in Cold War policy. So one thing that drove that a little bit was that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and the U.S. began aiding the Mujahideen, which were the Islamic fundamentalist, quote-unquote, freedom fighters who were rebelling against the communist government in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan had not really had a very stable government. They kind of went back and forth with different government regimes for decades before this, but they had this communist, kind of like Soviet-influenced government, and the Mujahideen were going against this, trying to institute a more fundamentalist Islamic form of government. So the U.S. began aiding them, supplying them with weapons during that time. So eventually, historians kind of look at this as being like the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, where eventually they fight and end up having to leave after a while. Anyway, so that was kind of one of those big focal points. Another thing that causes the U.S. to focus more attention on the Middle East was Saudi Arabia. Kind of opening up to more Sharia law type of rule, and kind of supporting the Wahhabi sect of Islam in 1979 as a result of a variety of religious tension that was going on throughout that kingdom. And they're a big supplier of oil to the U.S. So that's going to kind of change or start to shift the U.S.'s relationship with Saudi Arabia, and also its focus on the Middle East. And then, oh, sorry, I was going to miss that last bullet point there. And you had a lot of conflicts between Israel, which was a perennial U.S. ally since after World War II, and a lot of Islamic nations that it's it's kind of unfair. Like, it wasn't like they had like religious governments, but Egypt had a nationalistic government. But nations that are generally considered to be kind of bastions of Islam during that time, Iran, Syria, etc., in the Middle East. So a lot of problems with these Middle East countries between Middle East countries and Israel, that the U.S. was kind of on the side of Israel during that time. And probably most importantly, I'm skipping over things. I apologize. So the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. So it's just basically, if you were to put like a broad summary on why the Cold War ends, you've got the Soviet Union's economy just not being able to keep up with the amount of spending it needed in order to keep up with the U.S. And part of that is in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan comes in as president. He's a lot more, people use the term bellicose, or kind of a lot more aggressive in the beginning towards the Soviet Union, and is looking to spend lots and lots of money on defense. At one point, it talks about the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, where they're going to have these anti-missile satellites up in space, which most historians say was maybe not necessarily a bluff, but something that was never very close to even happening. But just a lot of this kind of strategic spending and military spending that the Soviet Union just could not keep up with the way that their economy was going at that time. The invasion of Afghanistan, much like the U.S. invasion or involvement of Vietnam, spending a lot of resources, a lot of blood, a lot of treasure. So they're kind of reeling during this time. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the Soviet Union president, and he calls for this period of glasnost, or openness, with the U.S. So trying to reform the relationship with the U.S. And actually, despite all his aggression that's seen early in his presidency, Ronald Reagan becomes a lot more friendly towards Gorbachev during his presidency, and they get along a lot better, and you start to see some opening of reforms. At the same time, Gorbachev is he's promoting the idea of perestroika, which is reforming the Soviet Union and moving away from the economic system, at least, of communism. So having the Communist Party still in charge, but moving away from the economics of communism and trying to open up more of a free market society. And that leads to reforms across the Soviet Union, and people plan coups against Gorbachev. Like, there are a lot of people that are upset about this. They see communism running out of power in the late 80s. But in November 1989, East Germany opened the gates of the Berlin Wall. They began the reunification of Germany. So Germany had been split between East and West Germany at that time, and they start to see their reunification process take place. And then later in 1989, you have Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, all major satellites or parts of the Soviet Union, start to get rid of their communist governments and exiting the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is just starting to crumble and break apart. And finally, by 1991, the communists lost control of the Soviet Union. So the Communist Party was no longer in control of the government of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union broke up into 15 independent republics, the largest of which, of course, is the Russian Federation. So you see, despite the fact that this was for 50 years the dominant issue in U.S. foreign policy, the Cold War kind of just fizzles out into the end, and the Soviet Union breaks up. So that's what happened. Now, there's varying perspectives on who created this situation and who should get the most credit for ending the Cold War. Should it be Reagan? Should it be Gorbachev? Should it just be the natural annals of history? So that's kind of what we're looking at with the perspectives. And then I would also be remiss in 1979, one of the other key things that happens is you have the Iran hostage crisis, which is going to have an impact not only on U.S. foreign policy, but what's happening with U.S. elections and how the U.S. wants to drive itself foreign policy-wise for the rest of the 80s and into actually today. You can see with the Iran nuclear deal. So if you're not familiar with the Iran hostage crisis, or you need a little bit of a refresher, this is actually, there's a lot of backstory to this, but I'm just going to give you kind of the high points that you need. So after World War II, the U.S. had helped install a monarchical leader in Iran, actually kind of like reinstalling the Shah in a way. So Iran had this democratically elected leadership under Mohammad Mossadegh, and he had moved to nationalize the British petroleum company that was operating in Iran, and that was kind of a no-no. So the U.S. and Britain kind of worked together to do a covert coup of Mohammad Mossadegh, and that brought back to power the Shah monarchical leadership. So this was Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and he had stayed in power since the 1950s, and despite the fact that he had instituted a lot of reforms that had helped open up the Iranian economy and kind of modernize it, he did also crush any type of uprising or rebellion, and was kind of seen as this like puppet leader that acted in the interest of the West, especially the United States. He also supported Israel, but the big important thing for the U.S. was that he kept the Iranian oil flowing cheaply to the U.S. And allowed the British to kind of have control over it. So you had the Saudis having oil flowing to the U.S., and then you had Iran, which was helping out a lot with the U.S. economy because cheap oil, especially cheap foreign oil, allows the economy to grow, related to aggregate supply, which I'm sure Rachel and Holly and Gregory Mankiw can tell you all about in some other video. So in 1979, the Iranian people staged an uprising. I apologize. You staged an uprising to overthrow the Shah and establish an Islamic government under Sharia law. A little bit different than Saudi Arabia. This was a Shia form of Sharia law. But the Shah, this is a little bit complicated because they say he fled to the U.S., but he also was being treated for cancer, and he went to a U.S. hospital, and the Iranians demanded that the U.S. return the Shah to Iran, but the U.S. said no, they weren't going to do that. They were going to allow him to stay and keep seeking treatment in the U.S., and he didn't have to go back. So some angry Iranians, especially a bunch of students, stormed the U.S. embassy in Iran, and they took hostages, and the hostages were stuck there for 444 days. If you've ever seen the movie Argo, there was this like covert mission to try to help some of them that initially escaped get out of Iran, but most of them were there for a little bit over a year. And they were finally released in 1981. But Iran and the U.S. have not necessarily seen eye to eye ever since, and this still is a huge focal point of U.S. foreign policy. There's a lot of consternation about whether or not Iran is going to develop nuclear weapons. In 2015, they had a deal with the U.S. on not enriching uranium for a period of 10 years. In 2017, that deal was thrown out by the new presidential administration, and you've kind of had conflict still brewing since then. So Iran's one of those major actors in the Middle East that is a focal point for U.S. foreign policy. So we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that a little bit, because it does relate to the end of the Cold War and U.S. involvement in that region today, which is going to lead to war on terror and a variety of other big historical issues. So I think and then the last thing, just some other like kind of lesser heard of U.S. intervention in the region during the 80s and into the 90s. In 1982 to 1984, President Reagan stationed troops in Lebanon. So Lebanon was fighting a civil war. Civil war, kind of in a little bit of an oversimplified explanation, was between the Christian groups in Lebanon and the Muslim groups in Lebanon that were vying for control of the government. Today they kind of have this like three-way government between the two major Muslim sects and the Christian sect of the population. But anyway, the U.S. actually stationed troops in Lebanon as part of a quote-unquote peacekeeping force during the Civil War. In 1983, a Hezbollah, which is a radical Islamic group that does a lot of terrorist activity in the region, detonated a truck full of explosives in front of the UN troop barracks, killed 240 Marines, 58 French soldiers, which led to U.S. retaliation for that. October of 1983, President Reagan ordered an invasion of the small Caribbean island known as Grenada in an effort to help a popular uprising against the communist regime there. So there's a variety of a lot of like more modern historical research by people that are interested in foreign policy has been done on the invasion of Grenada. It literally lasted like less than a day, but some people say it was because there were a lot of medical students from the U.S. there. Some people say it was because there was a communist government. The U.S. saw an opportunity to kind of overthrow it because that was kind of that was their jam during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So that was kind of one of those lesser known ones. First time I ever heard about it was actually in the movie Anger Management with Adam Sandler. There's a reference to it, but it's neither here nor there. In April 1986, President Reagan ordered air raids on Libya. Their leader, Muammar Gaddafi, who was overthrown in 2011, but back in the 80s, they ordered air raids on Libya after the Libyan intelligence was implicated in a bombing of a West Berlin nightclub that was popular with U.S. servicemen. So they didn't actually accomplish anything in terms of overthrowing or reforming that government, but they did kill 45 soldiers and 15 civilians, including one of the children of Gaddafi, I believe. So another type of intervention that occurred during the 80s. December 1989, this was actually, at this point, you're into the George H.W. Bush administration, but they sent troops into Panama to capture the Panamanian dictator, and he used to be a former U.S. ally. His name was Manuel Noriega, for facilitating cocaine smuggling. Again, one of those things where there's a variety of different perspectives, whether it was to stop drugs from coming into the country. A lot of people say America didn't really care about that during this time, unless it was crack cocaine, which goes into the war on drugs. Some people say it was because he was kind of cozying up to the Russians at the time. Again, variety of perspectives. And then into the 90s, you might have heard of the classic Josh Hartnett heartthrob movie Black Hawk Down, where American forces were ambushed in Somalia while looking for a Somali warlord, and they were stuck there, and they had to do an operation to try to get their troops out of there during the 1990s. So I will leave you there, but that's kind of the broad strokes of the end of the Soviet Union, as well as just a little summation of some of the U.S. intervention during the 80s that you might not have heard of, and then, of course, where some of that tension with Iran comes into play. So if you have any questions or you want to know more, let me know. But there's a couple other activities to do with the foreign policy parts of this that I want you to take a look at. So thank you for your time, and don't be a rabble rouser.